Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello. Anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism have been very controversial even before the October 2023 attack by Hamas on civilians, Israeli civilians, tragically began a war of genocide, as the International Criminal Court has ruled, as well as the United Nations and most governments have agreed throughout the world. The debate on equating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism is much older than this war that has been taking place in the last couple of years. And it started with, at the scholarly level, at the intellectual level, with two Jewish intellectuals, Hannah Arendt, the German Jewish intellectual who studied under Matter Heidegger, and I'll talk a little bit more about her in due course, and Barbara Tuchman. Both of these women approached the issue: is anti-Semitism the same as, is anti-Zionism the same as anti-Semitism? They approached the issue from different perspectives. And as we will see, ever since their works, this is not to say, by the way, that no one else thought of this, but they did contribute a great deal to this debate. And that's why I chose these two scholars, as we'll see. The question, of course, is that anti-Semitism has been weaponized by the state of Israel and by all those governments around the world, especially in the Western world, because most, let's face it, most are in the Western world, and especially the United States, in order to go on the offense and justify the war in Gaza. Excuse me. So what we have basically is the argument that anyone who is critical of the state of Israel is critical of the Zionist project, is critical of the apartheid state, of genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, etc., is anti-Semitic. So the idea is to identify the very heterogeneous Jewish population in the diaspora inside Israel as well as around the world, as Jewish scholars have pointed out, by the way, especially Jewish scholars who specialize in the Holocaust and genocide studies, to force them into that merging identity. If you're anti-Zionist, you're anti-Semitic. Therefore, Israel cannot be criticized no matter what it does, including committing war crimes and genocide. Now, there are 7,000 books on anti-Semitism, about 4,000 books on Zionism, very few indeed, linking the two. Overall, there are more than 50,000 books on racism. Most of those, by the way, deal with the largest issue of racism on this planet, and that is racism against Africans. In the last 500 years, from the transatlantic slave trade that the Europeans carried out in the Western Hemisphere to the present, that's where most of the literature exists. And as we will see, according to public opinion polls, both in Europe and especially in the United States, racism at the expense of descendants of Africans is the number one issue. At the very bottom is discrimination toward Jews, at the very bottom. So that is the reality based on public opinion polls. Now, the issue here is that it is rational, almost expected to have individuals, as we'll see, I'll talk a little bit about the psychology of discrimination, because this is at the domain of social psychology and sociologists especially. But it is almost natural, logical to expect individuals committed to universal human rights, committed to social justice, to come out in the forefront and argue against anti-Semitism. It is rather unusual, or any form of racism, by the way. It is rather unusual to have the people who reject social justice, who reject universal human rights, as the 1949 United Nations Charter called for, people who do not accept diversity, equity, pluralism, and inclusion. Very unusual to have those people use the issue of anti-Semitism in order to defend actions by those carrying out military solutions to political crises. That's very unusual. So what we have here is that the state of Israel, governments that support it, especially in the West and especially the United States in the forefront of this, businesses, as well as other institutions, above all the Western media, in the forefront of trying to conflate, trying to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. If you're against anti-Zionism, if you're against genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, the apartheid state, you're anti-Semitic. In other words, all the Jews in the diaspora, who, by the way, are as heterogeneous as all other people on this planet, no different than anybody else, all of them are put into this box through this mental construct, this ideological mental construct, so that the political agenda of those supporting the Zionist project and its actions in Palestine are justified, and therefore rejecting international law, rejecting the United Nations findings, rejecting international human rights organizations, including Israeli ones, by the way, which have concluded that this is indeed genocide, rejecting Jewish scholars from around the world that have come to the same conclusion. All of that tossed out. So what is going on here? As Noam Chomsky, who a brilliant Jewish American intellectual, pointed out years ago, long before this war, this genocide war, this is nothing more than propaganda. Noam Chomsky was absolutely correct. This is nothing but propaganda and going on the offense against those who criticize the war, who want an end to the war, who want social justice and peace, who want the end of apartheid, has been a defense mechanism to put the other side, those who obviously want all of this, who want universal human rights for as much for the Jewish population in Israel as for the Palestinian, put them on the defense so that they have the stigma of being anti-Semitic. Now, we have prejudice inside of us. Human prejudice is innate, in part. It is also, however, largely, mostly learned behavior. It is social conditioning. It is part of social conditioning. The issue is not discrimination at the individual level, or small group level, family small group level. The issue here is the um, institutional discrimination that has been taking place, and the institutional discrimination that has been taking place, including of the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism is roughly 500 years, actually more than 500 years, since the Black Death, according to Barbara Tuchman, actually goes back, way back, even before that in the Middle Ages and even in the ancient times. However, and Zionism is a project of the late 19th century. So the anti-Semitism is something that is long-standing, identified principally with Europe, okay? Zionism also, by the way, coming right out of Europe, imperialist, 19th century imperialist Europe, is really roughly more than about 100 years old, a little bit more than 100 years old. So the history of this is varies. It's very different. Now, the question of institutional discrimination is very important, because the issue is not whether an individual X is anti-Semitic or anti-Asian or anti-Muslim. That's not the issue at the individual level. The issue is whether there is institutional discrimination, especially in the public sector, but also in the private sector, because whatever takes place in the public sector by the state filters down to the private sector. And then that filters down to a culture of discrimination, exactly as we have seen in a number of countries, most glaringly, of course, in those countries like South Africa, the United States, where the Black population was systematically discriminated, institutionally discriminated. So the question here about anti-Semitism is there institutional discrimination on this particular matter, or is it individuals acting, or small groups acting against Jews? Whether those individuals, and by the way, the interesting thing here is that invariably those individuals and groups historically are on the far right. So here we have the irony that there are governments today who are hybrid authoritarian governments. That is, they're elected governments, but they follow policies that are identified with authoritarianism and are on the far right. If you look at what governments support the state of Israel, it is not exclusively, but many of them are on the far right. And at least in terms of policy, it is also true that there are liberal governments that support the state of Israel. Okay, so that is also true. That the support the state of Israel, by that I mean the policies of apartheid and ethnic cleansing, and of course this genocide of the last couple of years. So it's ironic that the very people who ideologically have been anti-Semitic historically, okay, this group now uses the issue of anti-Semitism from the right against those who are in the center and the left, the progressive elements, in order to silence any dissent and to have them and to reject the war crimes and the social injustice taking place against the Palestinian people, and to reject the concept of universal human rights as the UN defines it, by the way, in its charter. So this is also an interesting issue. Um, the the Zionist project is one that has, in fact, enormous propaganda machine behind it, especially not just in Israel, especially in the Western world. This would not be taking place were it not for a very highly organized campaign to identify anti-Zion, to conflate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, to make them inseparable, that one is the same as the other. The concern of the governments and the businesses and the media that support the Zionist state and what it has been doing, rather than support international law and the rulings of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice and the United Nations and the majority of the governments in the world with regard to Palestine. By the way, just for the record, most of the members of the United Nations General Assembly have voted to recognize the Palestinian state, something that the Israelis, as well as many of their supporters, the Israeli government, not the people, the Israeli government and many of the supporters of that government argue is anti-Semitism. In other words, to support a Palestinian state, sovereignty for the Palestinian people, is to be anti-Semitic. You can only support us. You reject us, that means that you're anti-Semitic. You hate us. You're discriminating against us. The question of the question of discrimination in scholarly studies, by the way, is very interesting, especially because it is in many fields, especially in the domain of psychology, and especially in social psychology. What we do see, and I mentioned this before, about human beings being conditioned, socially conditioned by society. We are born with certain innate traits to discriminate, partly as a defense mechanism, partly as survival, partly as opportunism. However, social conditioning is the key here for discrimination. The social conditioning is the key to identity at the individual level, social identity, group identity. And scholarly studies point out that indeed, especially in psychology, the discrimination factor, whether it takes place by Hindus in India against Muslims or Christians in the West against Jews or Jews against Muslims, any form of discrimination is the assertion of identity, but there is also a psychological aspect to this, which is the idea that separateness also necessarily, even perhaps subliminally, entails supremacy. So the idea of separate, for example, the Zionists believe they're the chosen people. The idea of the chosen people means what? That they are somehow higher, at a higher level, closer to God, which gives them license to do what? Gives the leadership, the elites, not the people. Because, by the way, there are many Jewish people all over the world, including inside Israel, who categorically reject all of this, this messianic vision. So what we have is the human mind, in discriminating, also sets itself at a higher level, that somehow there is a sense of superiority. And indeed, Zionism, was born in the late 19th century, and the ideology of Zionism in the 1890s was invariably influenced by a pseudoscientific movement, ideology back then called social Darwinism, which also influenced fascism and Nazism, by the way. The idea of social hierarchy and superiority. So Zionism comes out of that tradition. Anti-Semitism obviously predates all of this. And the idea of conflating the two, I want to stress this issue, is has been debated and continues to be debated. Two of the first scholars, both Jewish women that I want to, not that they're, again, I stress these were not the only two, that addressed this issue were Hannah Arendt, who studied under Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, by the way, an existentialist philosopher, and was influenced by European existentialism, Western existentialism, in the mid 20th century, comes out of the German tradition and the Nazi, the Third Reich, final solution, namely the extermination of the Jews policy. So Barbara Tuchman, developed a very strong sense of identity, Jewish identity, European Jewish identity, and had enhanced that position when she covered the trial of a Nazi officer, Rudolf Eichmann, in Jerusalem. She wrote a book by the same name, Eichmann in Jerusalem. Hannah Arendt, when she was in Jerusalem covering the trial of this Nazi for crimes against humanity, realized in 1960-62, she realized that the Zionist state in Israel, in some respects, was doing exactly what the Third Reich had done to the Jews. The state of Israel was doing it to the Palestinians, namely relegating them to secondary status and pursuing apartheid policies. Not that the state of Israel had a final solution, when obviously at all. However, Hannah Arendt recognized that Zionism was behind this this drive of creating a monolithic society, a society whose foundations, although the state claimed to be secular, whose foundations were based on monotheism, Judaism, to the exclusion of others. Not a multicultural society, hardly a democratic society, because it only included democracy only if you were within the confines of that Zionist state, and that's it. All others excluded. So she was very weary. She was very concerned about the Zionist project, about the state of Israel doing this, because she had lived through the Third Reich and she saw some similarities. On the other hand, Barbara Tuchman was not of the same view. She wrote a book, A Distant Mirror, tracing the roots of anti-Semitism back to Europe during the Black Death in the 14th century, and argued that there were deep roots there. However, unlike Hannah Arendt, who had a very different view about imperialism and about the Third Reich, what social Darwinism, on which ideology the Third Reich rested in part, by the way, not solely, Barbara Tuchman's position was to embrace imperialism, to embrace Zionism, in fact, and to defend Zionism, and any opposition to that would, of course, amount to anti-Semitism. Now, it's interesting that these two schools, when I was an undergraduate in the 1970s, I remember I read both of their works, and I remember the division in college at that time in Chicago of among scholars. The fact is that it was the progressive scholars who adopted the Hannah Arendt school of thought, and the more conservative ones who embraced Tuchman. Although Tuchman, the fact is, you have to embrace all those aspects of Barbara Tuchman's work on anti-Semitism, which are legitimate because the Europeans had a long-standing tradition. It was embedded in their culture, actually from the Crusades onwards, even before the Black Death, of anti-Semitism. They discriminated institutionally, culturally. So this is a reality. So there is validity to what Barbara Tuchman was arguing, until you get to the issue of the Zionist state. There is where we have problems, and where there's division, there's divergence. It's interesting that in the Western world, especially in the United States, many on the right, even some on the liberal center, followed the Tuchman school of thought, rejected the Hannah Arendt school of thought. There were those who argued that, in fact, they took Hannah Arendt's work and built on it, and argued that the issue here was very simple. Do human beings accept universal human rights, and governments accept universal human rights? And do governments use universal human rights as the criteria, so they do not discriminate against minorities, marginalized populations? Or do they reject that and use as a pretext some other form of discrimination just for a specific group, and carried out by individuals and groups, not institutionally, in order to embrace Zionism? And that was basically the argument. Now, there are, in the United States specifically, there are 2.3% of the population who are Jewish. The vast majority of the population, by the way, the minority population, is Hispanic, almost 20%. And and blacks about almost 15%. So if we put that together, you get more than a third of the population of the United States Hispanic and black. Jewish population about 2%, 2.3%. Tiny percent. Okay. The issue here is not, as many scholars have pointed out about anti-Semitism, is not anti-Semitism at the individual group level. That exists. We have to accept the reality. There are people, many of them mentally ill, by the way, who attack synagogues or attack Jews, wherever they, in different places. That's a reality. They also attack Muslims. They also attack blacks. Historically, they also attack Hispanics. Right now, there is a systematic drive against Latinos, right? The United States government, right now, in the last 9 months or so, has a policy of driving out illegal immigrants. Where are they from? Latin America. That is institutional, not at the individual level. Whatever some manager at a hotel thinks of the hotel maid who is from Guatemala, that's his or her business. However, when the government has a policy, institutional policy, targeting all from that region who happen to be legal immigrants, primarily, it's not just from that region, they also have others, in the group, but it's primarily those. But that's the largest population. That's the largest minority population in the United States, 19%, close to 20%, by the way. When you count the illegal immigrants, it's 20%. So we have, out of 350 million people, 20% are these. That is institutional discrimination. And, okay, when we look at public opinion polls, we find that 80% of the American people, 80% of the American people, I repeat, believe that discrimination is not against the Jews. 80% believe it's against blacks. Why? Because they were the population that was enslaved until the Civil War in the 1860s, in the early 1860s, until they were freed by Abraham Lincoln. Okay? And then after that, institutional discrimination in all forms, in the public sector as well as the private sector, by states, by the government, until the Civil Rights Act of 1965. But even after that, it continues, deeply embedded in the culture. The second group, according to the Pew Research Center, where we see discrimination, at 76% of Americans saying it is Hispanics. So blacks at the very top, not Jews, blacks at the very top, Hispanics second. The third group are Asians, especially South Asians, but also East Asians. Okay. The fourth group, again, not Jews, Muslims, 20%. The Jewish discrimination is at the bottom. One reason for this, and again, this is where great studies, scholarly studies have been done to explain all of this, to explain why the Pew Research Center public opinion polling reflects all of this. The reason for all this is because the class and minorities must be viewed together. When you look at Hispanics, especially Hispanics and blacks, making up almost 35% of the population of the United States, and by the way, in a couple of decades, certainly by the middle of this century, they will be the majority in the United States. They're almost 35% now. Another 50%, they will be above 50% when by 2050. Okay, at the very latest, by 2060, blacks and Hispanics will be the majority in the United States. They are the group that are most discriminated. These are the groups that are most discriminated. And they are invariably, the majority of them, in the working class. Very few. In terms of percentages, you have a small percentage when you compare it with the white population in the middle class. And of course, there are billionaires, black billionaires, and multimillionaires. Very few. The hegemonic group is still white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And guess who is at the top there as well? Jewish. When you look at the Jewish population in America, especially, but also in Europe, they have been well integrated into the middle class and the upper middle class. So class plays a role in this equation here. So one of the reasons for the discrimination is class-based. Okay, the Jewish population has been part of the hegemonic class, of the dominant class, influencing public policy to the advantage of that group and to the advantage of Israel. This is not the case for the Latino population, not the case for blacks, making up almost 35% of the population, again, 350 million people in the United States. So this is very important to take into account. The question is, when we look at public opinion polls, since we're on that subject, when we look at public opinion polls, because there is an election coming up. Today is October 27th, early November, we have an election in New York. Very important election, because for the first time, New York City will have a Muslim mayor, born in Africa, by the way. As President Trump keeps telling people, we're going to have an African president. He's of Indian descent. He's not African. He's of Indian descent, Muslim, and he is a New Deal Democrat, embraced by New Deal Democrats like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Now some of the mainstream Democrats are behind him. Now, interestingly enough, although the Jewish elite has converged with the Anglo-Saxon elite, okay, to make sure Zoran Mamdani does not win in New York City, does not become mayor, because this is a class issue here. It appears on the surface that it isn't, that it's an issue about a Muslim against, who, by the way, is against the state of Israel. He's made no bones about it. He is against the state of Israel carrying out apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. He has said so publicly. He's not running away from that agenda. He said, this is what the International Court has decided. I will follow the orders of the International Court and international law and the United Nations, not what the government in Washington, mainstream Democrats included, are saying about the state of Israel and its government. However, are the Jewish voters in New York City behind Mamdani, or are they against him? Since he appears to be, by the way, he appears to be anti-Semitic because they have painted it so. He is not anti-Semitic, he's anti-Zionist. However, when you have in the United States, the government, courts included, American courts, deciding that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism and that's a crime, okay? When you have that, and when you have millions of dollars, some of it coming from Israel, a lot of it coming from multimillionaires and billionaires inside the United States who support the state of Israel, who support Zionism, propagating, engaged in conditioning public opinion, molding public opinion, whether it's inside the Christian churches. A lot of literature on this issue, by the way, has been published, to make sure that they neutralize any criticism of the state of Israel, no matter what it does. The tragedy here we are in the 21st century, a genocide has taken place. And the tragedy is that when President Trump concluded this tenuous Gaza ceasefire, which is fine, except that it's not holding up, and it has nothing about the sovereignty of the Palestinian people, of social justice, of their rights, of including the many members, the vast majority of the members of the United Nations Assembly, General Assembly, who argued that the only way to resolve this issue is a two-state solution. None of that. So presumably what we're doing is ending the war, which is fine, but it's a step forward. Although it hasn't ended, it's continuing. Israel is pounding the Gaza. And what we're saying is, by the way, because we are proceeding with ceasefire, the war crimes committed and the International Criminal Court's decision, the warrants for the arrest of war criminals at the head of the government of Israel. Okay, we'll forget about that. In fact, we'll punish the court for issuing those warrants. We'll punish those criticizing genocide. This is the world we live in. This is the civilization of the West, which claims to be superior on this planet. Superior to what? defending genocide is indefensible. And to then turn around, because Noam Chomsky, by the way, Noam Chomsky's daughter has written a brilliant article about this issue of how anti-Semitism is used to justify genocide and to criticize the critics of genocide. This is amazing that that anti-Semitism is used as a weapon to criticize the critics of genocide. Amazing. It's amazing to me. Anyway, the 61% of American Jews disapprove of the war that Israel has been carrying out in Gaza, according to one public opinion poll. Even worse, 40% believe that Israel may have indeed committed genocide, exactly as the International Criminal Court has argued. Okay. The American people, according to public opinion poll, and roughly two-thirds of them, strongly disapproved of the Gaza war and the way that Israel conducted it. So what we have here is the divergence between governments and businesses, as well as the media, between governments supporting Zionism and using anti-Semitism to continue to support Zionism, no matter what it does to the Palestinian population. By the way, in the process, it also attacked its neighbors from Syria to Lebanon to Iran to Yemen. Anybody getting the way attacked? They attacked them. Qatar. Okay. Green light to attack. No criticism. Anyone criticizing the government of China would not be accused of being racist against the Chinese people. It's criticism against the Chinese government, against Xi Jinping and his government. It's not against Chinese people. Yet anyone criticizing Israel is anti-Semitic. That means criticizing all the Jewish people on the planet, who, by the way, reject that kind of equation, that kind of mergence between what the Zionist state is doing in Israel to the Palestinian people and to their identity, which to them, they want to define their identity. They don't want Netanyahu defining their identity. They want to define their identity. I'm going to conclude by saying a little bit about the media and anti-Semitism. It is no secret that the media has played, as both mainstream media and social media have played, an enormous role in molding public opinion, convincing many people that to criticize Zionism and the state of Israel, pursuing Zionist policies which are remnant of late 19th century white supremacy, social Darwinist thinking, to criticize that, and authoritarian, by the way, is to be anti-Semitic. They do not point out the obvious, that anti-Semitism has been weaponized to camouflage hybrid authoritarianism, whether it's in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in Italy, anywhere, or in the United States, anywhere in the world. Anyone who is using that issue to camouflage policies that are pro-war, against social justice and against peace. I am not optimistic about the role of governments and the role of the media. I believe that we will continue to have a situation where there will be manipulation because there is enormous amounts of money and political power wielded to make sure that it's that the ideological molding continues. So that means that I'm very pessimistic about the fate of the Palestinian people. It is tragic, just as it was tragic for centuries that the Europeans discriminated against Jews. And institutionally, let me make very clear, institutionally, it is also very tragic that the state, exactly as Hannah Arendt feared in the early 1960s, that the state of Israel is now doing the same thing to the Palestinian people. Anti-Semitism is to be abhorred. It is to be categorically rejected. It is a form of racism. It is a form of discrimination that should, in fact, the part of the universal human rights issue, part of social justice issue. However, just the same, this does not mean that there should not be a recognition of the human rights and social justice for everyone else, including Palestinians and Muslims. I thank you for listening. I ask you to write comments and join this channel. Thank you very much.